period in the 1930s, shockingly large numbers of middle-class intellectuals, the kind of people who populate the U.S. government, were becoming communists. It can be very difficult for us today to recapture that moment in the 1930s when so many people in that group became communists or were sympathetic enough to help them. Chambers said at the time, capitalism is going to fall not because we will break the locks, but because all the men who have been trusted to hold the keys are joining the conspiracy. In order to live undercover, Chambers had to adopt the lifestyle of a respectable bourgeois and blend in with the world around him. But there was one thing he refused to compromise on. In order to blend in, he had to hire a black woman as a housekeeper because that was the prevailing practice in the neighborhood. But although it meant a risk of discovery, he refused to pay her the lower Negro wage that was the acceptable practice. And even more risky than that, he invited her to dine at the family dinner table with the family. As a communist, Chambers refused to have segregated dining in his home. He would later write, "By acting as a communist must, I acted as a Christian should." However, he soon discovered that most communists were not as scrupulous as he was. At first, he thought that by entering the underground, he would be escaping the petty factional squabbling, the recriminations, and the constant cycles of purges and recriminations that were ubiquitous in the open party. But he soon found out that the underground had its own forms of destructive stupidity. The rise of communism to national power in Russia was producing a new kind of communist, careerist, corrupt, cynical. The party is nothing but a path to power for them. Chambers was forced to help the party to hurt people and even kill people in petty disputes that had nothing to do with the communist cause or advancing the world revolution. He went along with it, he said, because the only hope for a better world was communism. So if he disobeyed the Communist Party and was thrown out, he would lose the whole purpose of his life. But doubts were beginning to grow in his mind. Something else happened to Chambers as well. Into that world of death came the unexpected power of new life. And I'd like to share this with you. For one of us to have a child, my brother had said in his agony, would be a crime against nature. I longed for children, but I agreed with my brother. There had been enough misery in our line. What selfish right had I to perpetuate it? And what right had any man or woman to bring a child into the 20th century world? They could only suffer its inevitable revolutions or die in its inevitable wars. One extreme group among the communists held that it was morally wrong for a professional revolutionist to have children at all. They could only hamper or distract his work. That was one of the penalties of being a communist. I did not belong to that group, but in general, I shared their views. As an underground communist, I took it for granted that children were out of the question. Not only left-wing and underground communists took such matters for granted. Abortion was a commonplace of party life. There were communist doctors who rendered that service for a small fee. Communists who were more choosy knew liberal doctors who would provide it for a larger fee. Abortion, which now fills me with physical horror, I then regarded, like all communists, as a mere physical manipulation. One day in early 1933, my wife told me that she believed she had conceived. No man can hear from his wife, especially for the first time, that she is carrying his child without a physical jolt of joy and pride. I felt it. But so sunk were we in that life that it was only a passing joy and was succeeded by a merely momentary sadness that we would not have the child. We discussed the matter, and my wife said she must go at once for a physical check and to arrange for the abortion. When my wife came back, she was quiet and noncommittal. The doctor had said there was a child. My wife went about preparing supper. What else did she say? I asked. She said, I'm in good physical shape to have the child. My wife went on working. Very slowly, the truth dawned on me. "Do you mean," I asked, "that you want to have the child?" My wife came over to me, took my hands, and burst into tears. "Dear heart," she said with a pleading voice, "we couldn't do that awful thing to a little baby. Not to a little baby, dear heart." A wild joy swept over me. Reason, the agony of my family, the Communist Party and its theories, the wars and revolutions of the 20th century crumbled at the touch of the child. Both of us simply wanted a child. If the points on the long course of my break with communism could be retraced, that is probably one of them. Not at the level of conscious mind, but at the level of unconscious life. The child, even before her birth, had begun invisibly to lead us out of that darkness that we could not even realize toward that light, which we could not even see. As his daughter grew, Chambers used to love sitting there watching her in her high chair, smearing porridge on her face or meditatively dropping it on the floor. One day, he noticed her ear, how intricate and complex the human ear was, and the thought came burning into his mind, that could not have happened by accident. Only an immense design could have created that. The thought was unwanted, and he shoved it aside, but it would return to haunt him. In 1937, Stalin's purges reached their peak. Chambers watched as people who he had known and cared about for years, dedicated communists who had given their lives to the cause and to the party, were brutally murdered for no good reason. And his superiors laughed and joked about it. They enjoyed the cruelty. His doubts growing, Chambers read a book by a man who had escaped from a Soviet labor camp. He began to be haunted by the screams of those whom he had helped to hurt and to kill. The screams of people shot in basements or dropped down wells. The screams of children torn forever from their parents, never to see them again. The screams of people locked in railway cars and left on the railway tracks to freeze in the Siberian winter. Chambers said, "The vision of communism is the vision of the almighty mind of man, so no one ever really stops being a communist until they discover that there is something in man that is greater than the mind." Those screams of the people in agony were the cry of something inside human beings that is greater than mind, was the cry of the human soul. And they were crying out to the only thing that can hear a human soul. Another human soul. The screams, listening to the screams, caused Chambers to realize that those people he was hurting had souls and that he had a soul too. It began to dawn on him that the problem was not that Stalin had perverted communism. The problem was communism itself. As he said, the problem is not that Stalin is evil, but communism is even more evil. And only at the very end of that process did he finally allow himself to return to that thought that he had suppressed years earlier when he noticed his daughter's ear. He finally allowed himself to ask, what is it that we are missing that communism always goes so wrong? Could it be God? He had reached what he called the division point. The point where equivocation and compromise are no longer possible. The point where you have to choose one path or the other. He got down on his knees and prayed. And he began praying every day. And he came to need prayer like food and water. By turning to God, he was discovering who he really was. That illusion of the almighty mind of man began to fade away. Chambers said, reason is good, but there's a flaw in humanity, a flaw that causes great evil and suffering. And it goes beyond the realm where reason can reach. As he put it, the death camps exist first in our minds. When he finally left the Communist Party in April 1938, he left absolutely everything that he had except his wife and children. He had no career, and the Depression was on. He had no standing in any community, no relationships. He was a fugitive from both the American government and the Soviet government. He knew that the party's first instinct would be to kill him, possibly getting to him through his family. So he got himself a car and a weapon. He took his last stash of stolen documents and he gave it to a cousin to hide, to use as leverage against the party in case they kidnapped his wife or child. And then he fled into hiding for 6 months or so. After that, he emerged from hiding and he went back and contacted his former contacts in the underground. And he tried to persuade them to leave the party, to defect from the Communist Party. And he threatened to denounce them to the authorities if they wouldn't. In 1939 came the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the alliance between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And Chambers knew that the Soviet underground in Washington would be put at Hitler's disposal to use against the U.S. And so it had become his duty to become an informer. Becoming an informer was physically and spiritually repulsive to Chambers because it involved using people's trust in you to destroy them. It was a sort of slow-motion spiritual death for him, even though it was morally the right thing to do. And the worst of it was he went to the government and he told them everything he knew, and they didn't do anything about it. Through a friend, Chambers got the opportunity to apply for a job at Time magazine. He worked his way up from book reviews to senior editor. He became a Quaker. He returned to the deep peace of the Quaker meeting from his college days. The Chamberses moved to a family farm, which they worked entirely themselves, on top of Chambers' more than a full-time job as a senior editor of Time magazine. The farm was their witness against the materialism of the modern world. The farm said, "We choose this life of great hardship and great satisfaction because the modern world has nothing better than this to offer us." Over the course of 9 years at Time, Chambers watched as the people who had worked for him as Soviet spies moved their way up in the New Deal administration. Harry Dexter White led the creation of the World Bank and served as its first president. And a Harvard-trained lawyer named Alger Hiss, who had become the closest friend of Chambers' whole life during their service together in the Soviet underground, became a major architect of U.S. foreign policy in the post-World War II period. Hiss, who was a Soviet spy, sat directly behind President Roosevelt across the table from Stalin at the Yalta Conference. Hiss was essential in the creation of the United Nations. He later became the president of the Carnegie Endowment for World Peace. And in the initiatives of the New Deal, which involved not only safety net programs, but also massive central planning and quasi-nationalization of many industries, Chambers thought that he heard not communism, but a milder and more liberal form of that destructive vision of the almighty mind of man. In 1948, 10 years after he left the party and after 9 years at Time, Chambers was summoned to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He still had a large mortgage. He knew that by testifying, he could lose his job and the farm. He did, in fact, lose his job as a result of his testimony, although he did manage to keep the farm going until much later. He could have saved himself, saved his job, saved his position at the top of American society, at Time magazine, by just pretending not to remember very much. But he decided to tell what he knew. The nation did not understand either the extent or the totalitarian nature of the communist threat. Now, most of Chambers' contacts from his underground days by that time had either already admitted that they were communists, or had left the country, or had died, or pled the Fifth. But almost alone of the whole group, Alger Hiss, Chambers' closest friend in the whole world, stood up in public and denied everything. The public hearing at which Chambers and Hiss confronted one another was the first televised congressional hearing, not the more famous hearings about the mafia from the 1950s. In fact, you can actually see television footage of the hearings on YouTube. I'm going to play a quick clip here. This is a point where Alger Hiss has been listing a long list of highly respectable and powerful people that he's worked with, and he's bragging about his credentials. So let's roll that.
prominent Americans with whom he worked, including